So, Marc, your background is that you're a Harvard-trained biostatistician. You formed a company in 1991 called IDDI, which offers biostatistics, data management, and central randomization services.
That's right.
Okay. And you've made major contributions to the use or practice of statistical modeling techniques in clinical trials for many years. And now you and your partners have launched CluePoints, an intelligent statistical monitoring solution.
Mm-hmm.
As far as your background, how did you get into clinical trials?
Okay, clinical trials, I got involved when I was still in Belgium before I got my PhD from Harvard. I worked for an organization called the EORTC, which you may have heard of. It's the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer. And so I joined them very early on in my career, and that's actually how I got interested in biostatistics, helped them set up a database of clinical trials, and then got interested more in the statistical, aspects of clinical research, and then got my PhD and formed the company. But my interest in risk-based monitoring goes back to the late 90s. Patrick may have told you that I published a paper with many other authors. We have a paper out in Statistics in Medicine, which appeared in 1999. And back then, this group of people was interested in trying to use statistics to detect fraud in clinical trials. And that is because at that time, just as today, there have been some really salient cases of fraud, and people made a big fuss about them, and, how could we prevent this, and so on. And so we sort of looked at this issue from a statistical point of view, and we argued in the paper that, with proper use of statistics, these cases probably could have been either prevented or detected. Now that the FDA and the EMA have come up with these guidances on risk-based monitoring, now all of a sudden everybody's interested in the problem. And this particular paper is actually referred to in the FDA guidance. So I guess it's now going to become a little more known than it was in the 90s. But anyway, so that was our early interest in the matter. And then, given this paper, we started developing methods, statistical programs to detect fraud initially in clinical trials. And very soon we realized that, fraud was only a little part of the problem. Data errors, which differ from fraud because they're unintentional, but data errors could also be detected using the same sorts of approaches. And then over the years, we developed software to detect fraud or errors. And again, with very little interest from the industry, we conducted one trial with an academic group in France where we decided to use this system to try and detect problems in the data. And then, of course, we continued to develop the methods and try to improve on the software, again, with relatively little interest from drug companies. As a matter of fact, we always talk to drug companies from the angle of fraud detection, and not many people really want to have these kinds of discussions. It's not a good topic for anyone because, if you have a case of fraud, you don't want to be very open and you don't want to discuss it in great detail.
Right.
But we still continue to develop these programs. We changed the software 3 times. So we started from scratch 3 times. And the last time was, I think, probably the one that was the best, so to speak. The last time was when we redeveloped the whole system in a computer language called R, statistical language called R, and that is the current version of the system, which we call SMART, and that is the software used by CluePoints today. And like I said, it has gone through a lot of changes, software changes, rewrites, additions, and whatnot. So it does represent a large number of hours of work, but I think it's now fine-tuned to the point that it does deliver what we were hoping. When we run the system on a real trial, more often than not, we find really interesting stuff in the data. Even in trials that actually have been submitted for approval, we've, just for fun, we've run the system on some old trials that had led to drug approval.
Mm-hmm.
And in all cases, we find things. We find problems in the data that, of course, were not particularly relevant in terms of the validity of the trial, but are still interesting, data patterns that no one at the time had discovered. That's exactly the idea behind CluePoints. If you run it on an ongoing trial, the idea is to find abnormal patterns in the data, and abnormal may mean anything. It may mean the same values carried forward, repeated measurements that don't differ. It may mean too many missing values. It may mean variability in the data that is not consistent with the other centers, and so on. It may mean many, many different things. And then if you find such signals, then you would indeed, you would favor a visit to these centers in priority compared with the centers that show no data patterns.
So as you mentioned, all of a sudden now people are very interested because of the risk-based monitoring. I'm also finding that here in my role as observer that everybody's looking for information about risk-based monitoring and how to implement it so they don't get in trouble with the FDA or the EMA, and trying to figure out how to do it on a trial by trial or project by project basis. So in general,
Right.
What are your thoughts about risk-based monitoring? Obviously you've been thinking about it for a while, or at least some of these signals.
Yeah, I think it makes, maybe François can take over from me as far as risk-based monitoring in general. I'm looking at it from a very focused statistical perspective, but if you want my sort of personal opinion about risk-based monitoring, I think it's long overdue, and in particular, the reduction of trial costs, perhaps, with the reduction of monitoring visits, when you can, justify such reductions, I think that will save a lot of money. That is not well spent because it's very expensive to have these many, many monitoring visits to each site. And I think these visits are quite helpful for trial conduct, but probably not even useful at all for source data verification is okay. But for data checking, people just are not good at data checking. It's okay to look at the source documents and make sure that, the patient is a real patient. But I think it doesn't make sense to ask a human being to go through a very lengthy case report form and make sure that the data are correct, because they won't do a very good job at it. It's very expensive and not very effective. And as you know better than I, the trial budgets are just completely out of hand. And this is one way that I think some reason could be injected in the process, and reducing the cost of monitoring without jeopardizing the quality of the data is really what I think CluePoints can offer, and make sure that the data remain of good quality, and perhaps even improve the quality of the data by, finding strange patterns in them, and at the same time reduce the monitoring cost. So, we claim, and it remains to be seen obviously, but we do claim that CluePoints can achieve both lower costs, through a reduction of monitoring and also higher quality.